Introduction. My name is Philip J. Corso, and for 2 incredible years back in the 1960s while I was a lieutenant colonel in the Army heading up the Foreign Technology Desk in any research and development at the Pentagon, I led a double life. In my routine everyday job as a researcher and evaluator of weapons systems for the Army, I investigated things like the helicopter armament the French military had developed, the tactical deployment complexities of the theater anti-missile missile, or new technologies to preserve and prepare meals for our troops in the field. I read technology reports and met with engineers at Army proving grounds about different kinds of ordnance and how ongoing budget development programs were moving forward. I submitted their reports to my boss LT General Arthur Trudeau, the director of NER&D and the manager of a 3,000-plus man operation with lots of projects at different stages. On the surface, especially to congressmen exercising oversight as to how the taxpayers' money was being spent, all of it was routine stuff. Part of my job responsibility in NER&D, however, was as an intelligence officer and advisor to General Trudeau, who himself had headed up Army intelligence before coming to R&D. This was a job I was trained for and held during World War II and Korea. At the Pentagon, I was working in some of the most secret areas of military intelligence, reviewing heavily classified information on behalf of General Trudeau. I had been on General MacArthur's staff in Korea and knew that as late as 1961, even as late, maybe, as today, as Americans back then were sitting down to watch Dr. Kildare or Gunsmoke, captured American soldiers from World War II and Korea were still living in gulag conditions in prison camps in the Soviet Union and Korea. Some of them were undergoing what amounted to sheer psychological terror. They were the men who never returned. Now in Roswell in 1947, the landing of a flying saucer was no fantasy. It was real. The military wasn't able to prevent it, and this time the authorities didn't want a repeat of War of the Worlds. So you can see the mentality at work behind the desperate need to keep the story quiet. And this is not to mention the military fears that the craft might have been an experimental Soviet weapon, because it bore a resemblance to some of the Janin-designed aircraft that had made their appearance near the end of the war, especially the crescent-shaped Horton flying wing. What if the Soviets had developed their own version of this craft? The stories about the Roswell crash vary from another in the details. Because I wasn't there, I've had to rely on reports of others, and even within the military itself. Through the years, I've heard version of the Roswell story in which campers, an archaeological team, or rancher Mac Brazel found the wreckage. I've read military reports about different crashes in different locations in some proximity to the Army airfield at Roswell, like St. Augustine and Corona, and even different sites close to the town itself. All of the reports were classified, and I did not open them or retain them for my records after I left the Army. Sometimes the dates of the crash vary from report to report, July 2nd or 3 as opposed to July 4th. And I've heard different people argue the dates back and forth, establishing timelines that vary from one another in details. But all agree that something crashed in the desert outside of Roswell and near enough to the Army's most sensitive installations at Alamogordo and White Sands that it caused the Army to react quickly and with concern as soon as it found out. In 1961, regardless of the differences in the Roswell story from the many different sources who had described it, the top-secret file of Roswell information came into my possession when I took over the Foreign Technology Desk at R&D. My boss General Trudeau asked me to use the Army's ongoing weapons development and research program as a way to filter the Roswell technology into the mainstream of industrial development through the military defense contracting program. Today, items such as lasers, integrated circuitry, fiber optics networks, accelerated particle beam devices, and even the Kevlar material in bulletproof vests are all commonplace. Yet the seeds for the development of all of them were found in the crash of the alien craft at Roswell and turned in my files 14 years later. As an intelligence officer, I also knew the terrible secret that some of our government's most revered institutions had been penetrated by the KGB, and that key aspects of American foreign policy were being dictated from inside the Kremlin. I testified to this first at a Senate subcommittee hearing chaired by Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois in April 1962, and a month later delivered the same information to Attorney General Robert Kennedy. He promised me that he would deliver it to his brother the president, and I have every reason to believe that he did. It was ironic that in 1964, after I retired from the Army and had served on Senator Strom Thurmond's staff, I worked for Warren Commission member Senator Richard Russell as an investigator. But hidden beneath everything I did, at the center of a double life I led that no one knew about, and buried deep inside my job at the Pentagon, was a single file cabinet that I had inherited because of my intelligence background. That file held the Army's deepest and most closely guarded secret. The Roswell files, the cache of debris and information any retrieval team from the 590th Army Airfield pulled out of the wreckage of a flying disc that had crashed outside the town of Roswell in the New Mexico desert in the early morning darkness during the first week of July 1947. The Roswell file was the legacy of what happened in the hours and days after the crash, when the official government cover-up was put into place. As the military tried to figure out what it was that crashed, where it had come from, and what its inhabitants' intentions were, a covert group was assembled under the leadership of the Director of Intelligence Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter to investigate the nature of the flying discs and collect all information about encounters with these phenomena, while at the same time publicly and officially discounting the existence of flying saucers. This operation has been going on in one form or another for 50 years amidst complete secrecy. I wasn't in Roswell in 1947, nor had I heard any details about the crash at that time because it was kept so tightly under wraps even within the military. You can easily understand why, though, if you remember as I do the Mercury Theater War of the Worlds radio broadcast in 1938, when the entire country panicked at the story of how invaders from Mars landed in Growers Mill, New Jersey, and began attacking the local populace. The fictionalized eyewitness reports of violence and the inability of our military forces to stop the creatures were graphic. They killed everyone who crossed their path, narrator Orson Welles said into his microphone as these creatures in their war machines started their march toward New York. The level of terror on that Halloween night of the broadcast was so intense and the military so incapable of protecting the local residents that the police were overwhelmed by the phone calls. It was as if the whole country had gone crazy and authority itself had started to unravel. But that's not even the whole story. In those confusing hours after the discovery of the crashed Roswell alien craft, the Army determined that in the absence of any other information it had to be extraterrestrial. Worse, the fact that this craft and other flying saucers had been surveilling our defensive installations and even seemed to evidence a technology we'd seen evidenced by the Nazis caused the military to assume these flying saucers had hostile intentions and might even interfere in human events during the war. We didn't know what the inhabitants of these craft wanted, but we had to assume from their behavior, especially their interventions in the lives of human beings and the reported cattle mutilations, that they could be potential enemies. That meant that we were facing a far superior power with weapons capable of obliterating us. At the same time, we were locked in a Cold War with the Soviets and mainland China, and we were faced with the penetration of our own intelligence agencies by the KGB. The military found itself fighting a two-front war. One against the communists who were seeking to undermine our institutions while threatening our allies, and the other, as unbelievable as it sounds, against extraterrestrials who pose an even greater threat than the communist forces. So we used the extraterrestrials' own technology against them, feeding it out to our defense contractors and then adapting it for use in space-related defense systems. It took us until the 1980s, But in the end, we were able to deploy enough of the Strategic Defense Initiative Star Wars to achieve the capability of knocking down incoming enemy warheads and disabling enemy spacecraft if we had to pose a threat. It was alien technology that we used. Lasers, accelerated particle beam weapons, and aircraft equipped with stealth features. And in the end, we not only outlasted the Soviets and ended the Cold War, but we also forced a stalemate with the extraterrestrials who were not so invulnerable after all. What happened after Roswell, how we turned the extraterrestrials' technology against them, and how we actually won the Cold War is an incredible story. During the thick of it, I didn't even realize how incredible it was. I just did my job going to work at the Pentagon day in and day out until we put enough of the alien technology into development that it began to move forward under its own weight through industry and back into the Army. The full report of what did at NERM&D and what General Trudeau did to grow RM&D from a disorganized unit under the shadow of the Advanced Research Projects Agency when he first took command to the Army Department that helped create the military guided missile, the anti-missile missile, and the guided missile launched accelerated particle beam firing satellite killer didn't really hit me until years later when I understood just how we were able to make history. I always thought of myself as just a little man from a little American town in western Pennsylvania, and I didn't assess the weight of our accomplishments at Army RM&D, especially how we harvested the technology coming out of the Roswell crash until 35 years later after I left the Army when I sat down to write my memoirs for an entirely different book. That was when I reviewed by old journals, remembered some of the memos that I'd written to General Trudeau, and understood that the story of what happened in the days after the Roswell crash was perhaps the most significant story of the past 50 years. So believe it or not, this is the story of what happened in the days after Roswell, and how a small group of military intelligence officers changed the course of human history. In memory of LT General Arthur G. Trudeau. This great man was my superior as Chief of U.S. Army Research and Development. He was a man of great courage. He put on a sergeant's helmet and fought with his men at Pork Chop Hill in Korea. He was deeply religious and went on retreats at Loyola. He was the most brilliant man I have ever known, who only gave me one outstanding order: watch things for me, Phil. The rest do not understand. His accomplishments changed the world for the better. Any success I had, I attribute to him and to his leadership.